The relationship with Dean ends in 1956. The partnership ends in 1956.
10 years to the day.
To the day.
Jerry is on stage at the Sands. It's September 1976. The spotlight finds him mid-sentence, and his voice cracks, not from age, but from something closer to grief. Because walking toward him, unannounced, uninvited, is the man he hasn't spoken to in 20 years, Dean Martin. The audience doesn't understand what they're seeing. They think it's a reunion. They think it's beautiful. What they don't know is that Jerry never forgave him for leaving, and Dean never forgave Jerry for needing him in the first place. The embrace lasts 6 seconds. By most accounts, they never spoke again. This is not a story about a comedy team that broke up. This is a story about two men who built an empire on a lie so perfect, so polished, that even they started to believe it. And the lie was this, that they loved each other. The world saw magic. What the world didn't see was the trap. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis were the biggest act in show business, bigger than television, bigger than movies. They sold out every room they walked into, and for 10 years, they made it look easy. The bit was simple. Dean was the smooth operator, cool, drunk, unimpressed. Jerry was the spastic man-child who couldn't sit still, couldn't stop talking, couldn't let the audience look away. Together, they moved like a machine. But here's what most people miss. The act worked because it wasn't really an act. Dean actually thought Jerry was exhausting, and Jerry actually thought Dean didn't care. They performed the tension between them, and America paid to watch. But long before the Sands, long before the movies and the millions and the private jets, they were two desperate men trying not to drown. Dean was born Dino Cricchetti in Steubenville, Ohio in 1917. His father was a barber. The family spoke Italian at home. Dean didn't speak English fluently until he was 5, and even then he kept his sentences short. He learned early that the less you say, the less you owe. He dropped out of school in 10th grade, dealt blackjack, boxed under the name Kid Crochet, sang in mob-owned nightclubs where you didn't ask questions and you never ever acted like you needed the gig. Dean's survival strategy was to make everything look like it didn't matter. If you don't care, you can't be hurt. If you don't need anyone, no one can leave you. It wasn't philosophy, it was armor. Jerry, on the other hand, was born Joseph Levitch in Newark in 1926, into a family that lived and breathed vaudeville. His parents were performers. His mother played piano. His father was a Borscht Belt comic. But they were barely home. Jerry grew up in boarding houses and backstage dressing rooms, raising himself, watching his parents chase applause in towns that didn't remember their names. He learned the opposite lesson Dean did. He learned that love is earned by performance, that if you're funny enough, loud enough, desperate enough to please, people can't ignore you. And if they can't ignore you, maybe they won't leave. So, by the time Dean and Jerry meet in 1945, they are perfectly, fatally compatible. It happens in New York. Jerry is 18 and flailing. Dean is 28 and going nowhere. They're both playing the Glass Hat Club in Midtown, separate acts on the same bill, and one night they start goofing around between sets. Jerry does impressions, Dean plays the straight man, barely trying, which somehow makes it funnier. The audience loses it. Within weeks, they were team. Within months, they're the hottest nightclub act on the East Coast. Within 2 years, they have a radio show, a movie deal, and a contract that pays them more money than either of them ever imagined. And the dynamic is already set. Jerry works, Dean watches. Here's the thing people don't understand about Dean. His laziness was deliberate. He refused to rehearse. He refused to memorize blocking. He showed up 10 minutes before curtain, read the script once, and walked on stage like he'd wandered in by accident. It made him look cool and made him look like he was above it all, but it also meant Jerry had to do everything. Jerry wrote the bits. Jerry timed the takes. Jerry dealt with the directors, the producers, the network executives who wanted changes at midnight. Dean would show up, nail it in one take, and leave. And everyone loved him for it. Jerry, meanwhile, was grinding himself into dust. He was performing in every scene, producing behind the camera, choreographing the chaos, and pretending the whole time that he wasn't the one holding the whole thing together. Because that was the bit. The bit was that Dean didn't care, and Jerry couldn't stop caring. But off camera, Jerry was starting to crack. He developed an ulcer, started taking pills to sleep, pills to wake up, pills to get through interviews where Dean showed up late or didn't show up at all. And Dean? Dean was at the golf course. By 1954, they're making 4 movies a year. They're the #1 box office draw in the country. Paramount is building entire release schedules around them. But Jerry started to feel something ugly. He's starting to feel like Dean's prop, like the straight man is getting all the credit for doing none of the work. And it's worse than that, because the audience doesn't see Jerry as the genius, they see him as the clown, the schmuck, the kid who needs Dean to make him look good. And Dean starting to feel used. Because here's what Jerry didn't understand. Dean never wanted to be responsible for someone else's happiness. That was the whole point of the persona. He built his entire life around not needing people, not being needed, not being trapped by someone else's expectations. And now he's locked into a partnership with a man who needs him so desperately it's suffocating. Jerry wants to rehearse on Sundays, Dean wants to play cards. Jerry wants to talk about the next movie, Dean wants a drink and silence. Jerry thinks they're brothers, Dean thinks they're co-workers. The resentment builds slowly, then all at once. In 1955, Jerry starts directing. Not officially, he's not allowed to yet, but on set, he's calling shots, moving cameras, telling Dean where to stand. And Dean hates it. He doesn't say it out loud, but you can see it in his face in some of the later films. He looks trapped. He looks like a man who signed a contract he can't get out of. Meanwhile, Jerry's convinced the Dean's coasting. The Dean's forgotten how hard Jerry works to make him look effortless. It's a spiral. The more Jerry tries to control the act, the more Dean withdraws. The more Dean withdraws, the harder Jerry works, and neither of them can say what's actually happening because the act requires them to pretend they're fine. By 1956, they're barely speaking off camera. They show up, they perform, they leave separately. Dean starts booking solo gigs, singing gigs, where he doesn't have to share the stage. Jerry starts talking to Paramount about directing his own pictures without Dean. But they're still contractually locked in, still making movies, still selling out the Copa, still pretending in every interview that they're best friends. And then, in July 1956, everything breaks. They're filming Hollywood or Bust, their 16th picture together. It's a road movie, which is ironic because by now they can't stand to be in the same car. On the last day of shooting, Dean walks off set without saying goodbye, just gets in his car and drives away. Jerry finds out later from someone else that Dean is done. He's not renewing the contract, he wants out. No discussion, no warning, just gone. Jerry is blindsided. He thinks they'll talk it out, work it out, figure it out. Dean thinks there's nothing to figure out. He's been done for years. The official split is announced a few weeks later. The press calls it amicable. It isn't. Here's what the papers didn't report. Jerry was devastated, not just personally. He'd built his entire identity around being half of something. Dean and Jerry, Martin and Lewis. He didn't know who he was without the act. He spiraled. Started seeing a psychiatrist 3 times a week. The pills got worse. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. His wife later said she was afraid he'd hurt himself. Dean, meanwhile, seemed fine. He started a solo singing career, played the Sands, smiled for photographers. When reporters asked him about Jerry, he shrugged. He said, "We had a good run. Now we're doing our own thing." But here's the detail almost everyone misses. Dean was lying because Dean's entire adult life was built on the idea that he didn't need anyone, that he could walk away from anything, anyone, anytime. That was the armor, that was the shield. But Jerry had gotten under it. Not because Jerry was special, but because for 10 years, Jerry had needed him so loudly, so desperately, that Dean couldn't ignore it. And walking away from that didn't feel like freedom, it felt like proof. Proof that Dean was exactly what he'd always feared. Cold, unfeeling, alone by choice, but alone nonetheless. He never said that out loud. He just drank more. Jerry, meanwhile, threw himself into work. He directed The Bellboy in 1960, his first solo picture. It was a hit. He directed The Nutty Professor in 1963. It was a masterpiece. He played a nerdy professor who invents a potion that turns him into a smooth, arrogant lounge singer named Buddy Love. Everyone knew who Buddy Love was. It was Dean. Jerry spent the whole movie condemning him, and the whole movie trying to become him. It was revenge. It was therapy. It was the closest Jerry ever came to saying what he actually felt. Dean never saw it. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. Their lives ran parallel after that. Dean joined the Rat Pack, Sinatra, Sammy, Lawford, Bishop, and became the effortlessly cool sidekick again, but this time with people who didn't expect him to rehearse or care. He got his own TV variety show in 1965. The Dean Martin Show ran for 9 years. He'd show up minutes before taping, read off cue cards, sing a song, fake drink his way through sketches, and go home. It looked like he was phoning it in. That was the point. The less he cared, the more people loved him. Jerry became a solo superstar. He raised millions for muscular dystrophy, hosted telethons, directed, produced, controlled every frame. He worked so hard that his body started to break down. Back surgery, painkiller addiction, heart problems. But he couldn't stop, because stopping meant facing the silence, and the silence meant remembering that the person he'd loved most in his career had left him without looking back. For 20 years they didn't speak, didn't call, didn't write. Dean would occasionally be asked about Jerry in interviews, and he'd smile that distant smile and say, "I wish him well." Jerry would be asked about Dean, and he'd get tight-lipped, emotional, and change the subject. Then, in 1976, Frank Sinatra decides to fix it. It's Dean's birthday. Jerry's performing at the Sands in Vegas. Frank arranges the whole thing, gets Dean to show up unannounced and walk on stage during Jerry's set. The audience goes insane. Jerry's visibly shocked. He tears up. They hug. It looks like forgiveness. It looks like reconciliation. The cameras eat it up. But when you watch the footage closely, you see something else. Dean's smile doesn't reach his eyes. Jerry's holding on a little too long. And when they finally pull apart, there's nothing left to say. They stand there for a few seconds, and then Dean leaves. The applause fades. The show goes on. They never spoke again. Not after that night. Not when Dean's son, Dean Paul Martin, died in a plane crash in 1987, and Jerry wanted to reach out but didn't. Not when Dean's health started to fail in the early 90s, and Jerry thought about calling but couldn't figure out what to say. Not even when Dean died on Christmas Day, 1995, and Jerry gave interviews saying he was heartbroken, but couldn't explain why he'd never picked up the phone. Because here's the truth they never said out loud. They didn't break up because they hated each other. They broke up because they loved each other in ways neither of them knew how to handle. Jerry loved Dean the way his son loves a father who's never home, desperately, resentfully, completely. Dean loved Jerry the way a man loves something he can't afford to need, carefully, distantly, with one foot always out the door. And the worst part, the act made it impossible to fix, because they'd spent 10 years performing a relationship that was funnier, simpler, and safer than the real one. And when the real one got messy, when Jerry needed too much and Dean couldn't give it, they didn't know how to stop performing long enough to be honest. So they did what they always did. They walked away. Dean made it look easy. Jerry made it look like a wound. And both of them spent the rest of their lives pretending it didn't matter. But it did. When Jerry died in 2017 at 91, he was surrounded by family, accolades, and decades of work. But in his final interviews, when asked about Dean, he'd get quiet. He'd say Dean was the best partner he ever had. He'd say he missed him. He'd say he wished things had ended differently. And then he'd stop talking, because there was nothing left to say that would sound like begging. Dean, who'd been gone for over 20 years by then, never got the chance to say whether he felt the same. The tragedy of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis isn't that they broke up. Partnerships end. The tragedy is that they were two men who needed opposite things. One needed distance to survive, the other needed closeness to feel real. And they built a career on pretending that contradiction was comedy. For 10 years it worked. The audience laughed, the money poured in, they were the biggest act in the world. But the bit was always doomed, because you can't perform your way out of the truth. You could only perform until the truth makes it impossible to keep going. And by the time they both understood that, it was too late to go back. Look again at that moment in 1976. Jerry on stage, shaking, trying not to cry. Dean walking towards him, smile in place, already half gone. The audience thought they were watching a reunion. What they were actually watching was two men realizing in real time that the best years of their lives were built on something neither of them knew how to name. And the cruelest part? They were right.